is yet another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your host, Dean Walker, and this is my lovely guest, Melody LeBaron. You may recall, if you are a frequent viewer of the Poetry of Predicament, that we spoke together, Melody and I, a few months ago on this podcast, and we got to hear a little bit about, Melody, your orientation toward grief as one of the many things that you educate and facilitate about, and on now, as with all of us, exclusively on the internet, but from a long time, a long lineage of facilitating live events and groups as well. And you and I have a remarkable project that we're piecing together that is a grief ritual over 2 days online in November of 2022. All the information will be available on the screen later on, and of course in the show notes below. And this is really the opening of probably this conversation will be broken up into a number of smaller parts. Seems like it kind of wants to be that way in my experience. These are this is an important conversation, and I, without being too hyperbolic about it, my experience of these times that we're in is, this really is the time that many of us have been warning about for quite some time. For those of us who have had our attention out into the near-term future, it hasn't been looking good for a long time. And our culture is built in a way that there's a membrane of resistance culturally across the entire, certainly across the whole USA, and I would say that it's far larger than that, where any news that is not a way of keeping the status quo in place, keeping everybody with a smile and everybody working hard, and if we just vote for the right candidate, everything will be okay, and if and on, the wheels keep turning. And as long as those wheels are turning and we're all watching the right television shows and we're all consuming the right things and working hard to keep our particular set of machinery in place, then things flow along well, and there doesn't seem to be any resistance. But as soon as somebody talks about what to me is the bold truth that has not been spoken, that's when the resistance starts. That's when the membrane of resistance goes up, and it can actually be quite a strong and even a violent resistance. But I think in the USA in particular, we are a death phobic and a grief phobic culture. We can look at the national response to the COVID death and all the suffering and all the death that occurred around the world, of course, with COVID. We got to see, and we're seeing right now, actually, we still have COVID plenty present for us, with some strong numbers of people dying still. And that membrane of resistance is up and as strong as ever. So I really wanted to speak with you today, not just so we could speak a little bit about our orientation in this upcoming shared online ritual, why each of us has this, what I was just trying to express earlier, this cornerstone in this whole conversation of what are the core capacities that we need when we're facing a culture that is clearly self-terminating. We are on a very shadow-filled and grievous path, yet we have almost no ability to grieve. We have almost no ability to even open the door of an inch or two to be able to experience grief ourselves individually or together.
Right.
So thanks for sitting through that kind of long introduction. And I'm wondering if any of the things that I've mentioned as sort of a precursor, if any of them spark you to want to share anything.
My experience of almost 70 years has taught me that we take birth as humans, and the human experience contains a continuum, a range of emotions and experiences. And if we could depict that or visualize that as a vertical line with an arrow at the top and an arrow at the bottom and a midpoint, it seems to me that Western culture is designed to focus attention on everything above the midpoint and resist or even deny everything that's below the midpoint. And yet my experience gardening and with trees teaches me that in many cases, the root system, what's below what we can see, is what results in the health or the lack of health of the actual plant. And I believe that's true for humans as well, that as we will increase our capacity, our competency below the midline in the more uncomfortable of the human experiences, we will not only grow further above the midline, but we will then have more radiant compassion, more fierce non-judgment to meet moments with our loved ones well when they are going through times of loss. And so for me, this is really about maturing beyond what the overculture has focused on, which is everything above the midline. Let's be happy. Let's be comfortable. And let's not look at loss, and let's not look at grief, and let's not look at what's dying or needs to die in the culture. Yeah, so for me, it's really about maturing our perspective, our skill set, our emotional competency.
Melody, we've talked about this a lot. This is a particularly rich place for me in the conversation about grief. So I'm hearing you say that the more we'll extend ourselves into those roots that we're coming from, those roots that, it's where the darkness is. It's where the acknowledgement of the core essential quality that death has innately, but we resist with everything we've got. And I hear you saying that our exploration of that, our digging our hands into that dirt, so to speak, and allowing ourselves to really dive into the experience of our grief, that natural, essential skill of diving into that grief is so life-giving in an unpredictable way.
Right.
I also heard in the last couple of sentences you said about this is something we could and should be doing together.
Oh, there are some griefs, Dean, that we cannot hold. Some losses we cannot hold and should not try to hold by ourselves. Absolutely. Yes, coming together as a community to hold losses at the scale we're seeing now is the only way to have a resilient heart, is to come together in community. And it doesn't have to be a community you've known for decades. It can be a sudden community.
That leads us to why we're even putting together this 2 days of being together online. It's pretty bodacious to think that we can share grief at some depth online, but I think we've all been seeing for these past couple of years, there's an extraordinary well to be dipped into there. I've had extraordinary times of connection. I think at the level you're talking about. There's also there seems to be a part of the calling that I'm hearing, and I could use your help in finding words for it. We seem to be in a time that is more polarized than I've certainly ever experienced in my lifetime. And this is at a time when it again appears to me this is a time that's calling for us to come together at a level we've never yet experienced. And so what seems to be missing in there's a little formula, there's a little meme that I'd like to share with you and see if you could help me shed light on it in a good way, that we can only grieve that which we love. There needs to be love there, and love implies relationship.
Right.
And the depth of relationship, the depth of connection with other human beings seems to be as stretched thin as again I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Right.
I guess I'll give you my sense of that meme, and what's at the core of it is every time, without exception, that I have dug my hands into that depth and that dark and that the dirt, the kind of the soul dirt that is grief for me. That's how I feel it and experience it. I can't help but through the tears experience more and more love for the elements around me. And every time, and for years now, my rituals, my grief rituals, have primarily been with other people. So I can feel this infusion of love in every direction in the ritual. So that's as much as I've got to be able to, put it into linear words. Can you help me fill that out a little bit?
I'm reminded as you say this, I am reminded of my very first meeting that I went to of the Compassionate Friends. So this would have been 25 years ago. Yeah, it was about this time of year. So my son, Logan, 17 years old, the passenger in a car with his friend, who went off the road, hit a utility pole, which came down on top of Logan. And he died in our arms in Vanderbilt Hospital 3 days later. And I'd never heard of Compassionate Friends before this, but someone a couple months later told me about it and went with me to a meeting. And so I just want, everyone to imagine, like, it was a really raw and vulnerable time for me, going into a room full of strangers and knowing that everyone in there had lost a child. And I remember in that first meeting parents whose children had died 20 and 30 years earlier, or 10 years earlier. Like, most of the parents in this group had been there a long time. And there were really two groups, two camps in this room. And it didn't take long before it was clear to see who was who and which group the parents were in. Because for some of the people in that room who had done their grief journey well, who had met the moments of their own private grief well, and had created strength for themselves, were there in radiance, talking about their child, but they were there as channels of love and compassion to flow through. And then there were other parents who were completely shut down, or they were in anger or blame, or, it was the doctor's fault, their child died, or it was this or that person's fault. And I could understand all of those emotions. I heard all of those stories and understood why it was so tempting for some to stay in that place of anger and blame. And right away, I saw that I had a choice. By this time, 2 or 3 months into the loss, I knew that I was going to experience tidal waves of emotion, very different kinds of emotion, as I processed the death of my son. And I saw clearly in this first meeting that I would have a choice, and I would either move toward the grief when it moved toward me, and I would lean into these waves and let them move through my body and keep breathing through the waves of grief, or I would resist and I would end up like some of these parents who 20 and 30 years on were still in this very shut down, closed off physical, mental, and emotional state. And I made a choice in that first meeting that I wanted my son's memory to live in my body and to live in my community and family and to live in the world in a way of honoring and not, I felt like to do anything less would be dishonoring to his memory and dishonoring to my love for him. I want, when I speak his name, for love to flow rather than the anger or the uh, blame or the bereftness. I wanted not to feel like a victim, even though there were circumstances that could have allowed me to feel like a victim. And, another thing I realized during those months going to those meetings is that we are here having a human experience, and loss and death will touch all of us. And so, that question, why me, happens. And my response to that question, why me, became, perhaps this is how you will touch or taste the sufferings of the world. Perhaps this will be the biggest loss I will experience and integrate in this lifetime. And perhaps this is how I participate in the sufferings of humanity. Well, why not me? And so much like you described, Dean, I do experience in those moments of grief. For me, it's a very visceral, uncomfortable, physical experience of feeling like I'm down in the dirt and the dark and the difficult, the challenging emotions. And I'm comfortable there now. I'm comfortable in the discomfort because I have some experience. I know those waves of grief, those intense waves of grief, are going to last anywhere between 60 and 90 seconds. And if I can breathe through them, and even if another one comes in 3 minutes, I can breathe through that one. At the end of it, I'm going to be more vital and more alive than I was before.
Melody, I just thank you so much for, I'm just feeling a wave, a sympathetic wave with what you've just been sharing. I can't imagine, I'm not a parent, and I can't imagine the depth of grief of a parent losing a child. It's so extraordinary. It's just a scale I can't imagine in my system. And so I appreciate your touring us through that part of the territory you now are very familiar with. And I'm hearing that it, of course, was not in any way an easy journey, but you've turned it into such a blessing, such an apparent blessing, that it opened up a very different territory, one that's not intuitive for those of us who have been resisting, spending our lives resisting anything about death or anything about grief or anything about loss for that matter. So I just want to pause for a moment. I'm going to be dividing this conversation up into a number of pieces. And if that's about as intimate and personal and extraordinarily deep as I can imagine that what you've just shared, in an odd way, I can see it. You gave us also a little window into your experience of that support group. And you actually had a vivid contrast that you saw in this parents who have lost this unimaginable level of loss, and some of them having a rather pinched down, stunted capacity to be really present with these waves that you're talking about. And that's exactly how it shows up for me. Grief has always showed up for me as waves. Maybe it's from my early days as a surfer. I don't know. But you also gave us that contrast of between the people who have not opened themselves up to what it is to increase our capacity for those waves to move through, to give them their natural flow through our system, rather than trying to resist them, dam them up, somehow encase them in, if it's anger or regret or depression, or we all, I think, have a sense of the various ways that people try to resist. And yet you also gave us a picture of a number of different exemplars, people who had instead opened it up, opened themselves up. Reminds me of the title of this ritual we're doing, hearts broken open together as a part of that surrender to the flow of those waves that just want to come. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about expanding that out from that very personal level you were just sharing on out into these larger expressions that I believe we're all forced to encounter. I don't think this is going to be the kind of random, select people over, small number, little bit by bit. I think we have a global culture that is having its face collectively pressed up against the glass of how will you experience this as a global culture. Anything that you might like to share?
Yeah, I think it's really important for those of us in the West to recognize that our culture is not mature in certain aspects. You talked about death phobic and grief phobic, and for us to recognize, yes, we lead the world in some ways, and we have some immaturities in our culture. And those of us who have had our own personal significant losses, or we are proximate, we are proximate and paying attention to inequities or um, uh, social justice issues where we see entire communities of people not only underserved but unserved, and we see and we feel the grief. We feel the grief that is a part of that, and or we are paying attention to the war in Ukraine, or are we paying attention to what's happening in Iran, or to our climate and to some of the communities that are impacted by worsening storms. Those of us who are elders, not necessarily in years, but in our capacity to be of service in our community, if we're paying attention, we are going to feel grief. And if we're not feeling grief about what's happening, the polarization of politics and so on, we're not paying attention. And so, what do we do with that grief? What do we do with those feelings of loss of civil discourse, loss of habitats, loss of species? What we need to do, what we want to do, is actually feel that and process that on a regular basis so that we are current with our own grief work, our own grief journey, so that we have more vitality and more resilience and more capacity to serve our community.
Yeah. I'd very much like to acknowledge the lineage that you and I both share. I know we both have our own depth of experience personally and other lineages just by association over time, but we both have a lot of affection for and affinity for and resonance with the work of Francis Weller, who I consider to be one of the foremost voices of sanity and soul as they are both explored or exposed by healthy grieving together on a very regular basis. Call it hygiene, soul hygiene, if you will. And
Yes.
I'd like to just speak a little bit about what, really why, as almost as soon as we were done with the interview that we did months ago, and I picked up and read your book and so on, I really wanted to do something with you because I knew that there was that resonance. It showed up immediately in your own book, which is just beautiful, by the way. And of course, the link will be here in notes. I'd like to just mention a few things that I'm actually very moved even right now when I'm thinking about what will we will be including, because we include it for ourselves individually in our own practices. And that is to include movement, moving our body, that this is happening in our bodies. This is
Right.
resident. These souls can be accessed only through these bodies.
Right.
And that includes, to whatever degree it will be right for a person to join us in dance and in speaking, and it could be sharing poetry, it could be just sharing one's journaling that then wants to be just shared verbally. So there's this exchange and fluidity of exchange in those ways. And then, something that I have so anchored in my experience through many workshops with Francis and Judith over the years is to be able to feel in two ways, in two different directions. I'm able to feel and anchor in my body. One, on the inner dimension of it, I'm able to cue myself through some cues, some allies. I like to call them allies. They're just things that I can touch, that in the touching of them, it's resonant with me. It almost immediately activates in my system. For instance, uh, I'll have a bowl of dried leaves, and if I'm looking for the experience of that entry level into grief itself, into the sorrow and the grief itself, I can just touch in and crumble those leaves in my hands. And in the space of that altar that I've created for myself, and in the space that's created, that we will have created with the others on the screen here, there's that immediate activation of that particular essence of the grief experience. And there are other times when there's fear is a particular part of my grieving with some element. There are some people that I had elements of fear that I have lost in my life. And to touch, what I usually use to represent that fear is a rock. It's cold, it's hard. Oh, look, there you go.
Here's mine. Yep.
And so there's nothing quite like it. So that if I need to remind myself of, it's my intention to grieve this particular person or this particular part of my life, or as you were saying, just the scale, this particular species or this particular habitat, global habitat. Whew. If I were to touch these elements, each of them activating a part of my system. So that's the inward activation,
Right.
that we're going to be bringing and introducing and cultivating and inviting each person to use in the way that's right for them. And then there's the outward activation. So I'm just slowing down for a moment to just feel that, because that's something that I'm familiar enough with. I can just activate it right now, and I'm doing it with you, and even out into the space here, to be able to activate my attention and my presence and that soul infusion that Francis so brings to us in this beautiful way. That's seems to be where that magic occurs of grieving together, trusting one another, cracking, instead of contracting away to try and handle it on my own and kind of suffer in silence and so on, to crack open and to trust the space and have a gorgeous community around me saying, your tears are so welcome here.
Yes. Yes. You know, it's one thing to read Francis's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and I recommend it to everyone. Like it's a good read. And I've read it several times.
Mm,
But it's one thing to take this in to the mind. It's altogether a different thing to come into sudden community and to allow the body to have an experience with other bodies. Now, as you mentioned earlier, I'm used to doing these grief retreats in person, and we create a big, huge altar, and we
mhm,
spend 2 days in the room with each other. And what I've discovered, what you've discovered, is that we are still connected, even if we're all over the world, wherever we
mhm,
are,
mhm,
if we come together with our hearts open to one another and open to what our own grief process has for us, has to teach us, it will shift and it will become a physical experience. So, taking things in with the mind is a wonderful thing. I love to study something before I experience it, because then my mind is understanding what's happening in the body.
mhm.
But without the component of having an actual experience, you haven't done the thing. You can read about riding a bicycle, but until you get on the bicycle,
Right,
you
right.
haven't ridden the bicycle. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Melody, it is always so rich to share with you and create with you and I guess I'd like to close this conversation by really extending this invitation that you and I've been. All of this has been an invitation to come and join us in a grief ritual and an intentional and yet uh, brief community. Um, I'd like to extend this invitation out, particularly to the collapse aware community, to the activist community, to the doomer or doomist community. You know, there are so many kindred spirits. I know folks in each of those domains, and every one of us brings our heart to our work one way or another. But I want to call us all out a little bit as well. More than anything, if we've grown up in this business as usual culture, which of course we all have, and we're still immersed in it all the time, we've learned to override. We've learned to just bury it, to resist it, to suppress it. And what you and I have been talking about here is to allow ourselves to crack open.
Yeah.
And this isn't about hopium, which is a lot of folks in the doomer community are fond of throwing that word around with disdain. For anybody who has any hope that the business as usual culture will sustain, this isn't about that.
No.
This is about full aliveness with one another, no matter what is out ahead of us, no matter what the future may bring, no matter how challenging the present might be.
Right.
It's about deep diving into, leaning into the fullness of the experience, including the pain, including the grief, and an invitation to explore what if it were possible that on the other side of that grief and pain and loss is a chance for extraordinary connection and aliveness and intimacy with each other. I would call us out, those of us in the doomer community, come and let's shed some tears together. I think it will do us well.
Mm.
Yeah.
You know, years ago, I was I was so blessed to sit around a fire with at the Ancient Wisdom Rising conference with many, many indigenous elders from around the world. And one of them was Ilarian from the Aleutian Islands. And I remember part of what his wisdom was to, his request of us was to create for ourselves connection in community. And if you think about how our far back ancestors lived, you know, my parents both grew up on the land, farming, and they lived in community. And we are wired to have connection and to be in community. And some losses are not meant to be carried alone. And we are facing, those of us in these communities you've mentioned, we are facing, we're not looking away. We are looking at the loss of habitats.
Yeah.
We're looking at the loss of species. We are all grieving in our own ways. And to come together in connection and in community will allow us to process the enormity of that grief in a good way, so that we do have more resilience to face what's ahead of us.
Mm.
And, you know, I feel blessed, Dean, because my work with the dying, which started when I was 35 years old, so almost half my life, I feel so blessed that I have learned, and many of them, and they use this phrase, and this is after they have, like, they're on hospice, right? So they know they're terminal. I have never felt more fully alive.
Yeah.
And I don't know what's ahead for me. I do know that I'm going to die at some point. I'm having a mortal experience and it's going to be over. And I want to live out the remainder of my days in a good way, in full aliveness, like many of these people who stand in my consciousness as my spiritual support team now.
Yes.
The love they had and displayed for me and for the ones in their life remains with me. And I want to live with that kind of joy and aliveness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, there's the invitation for the folks who will be watching this conversation, whether it's in a few small segments or all the way through. All the information that you might need to join us in this November 2022 ritual is down below in the show notes. Melody, thank you so much for taking this time to share out into the community.
Thank you, Dean.